So we'll go ahead and kick things off. For those of you that are with us, welcome to the February 2025. It's almost incredible to say that, but welcome to the February 2025 edition of TrustMasters Monthly. Today we have not just technical knowledge leader and R&D director for A-LIGN, Joseph Cortez, but also an expert with deep knowledge of the domain that we're here to discuss with you today, which is penetration testing. So Joe Cortez, thank you so much for choosing to participate today. We're very grateful to have you.
Thanks, Patrick. Definitely happy to be talking about this. It's not just what I do, but it's been a hobby for a very long time. So
and Joe, without ado, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I am so excited to keep things moving forward. But this that we're here to talk about today is penetration testing. So for our listeners, our viewers, would you care kind of in your own words to talk just a little bit about what penetration testing is from your perspective and then why it's so critically important?
Absolutely. So penetration testing, the best way I can describe it is a way to understand what the exploitable vulnerabilities are. And notice I said exploitable. So there's a lot of different processes you can do to understand what your threat surface is. You can do vulnerability scanning, you can do code scanning. I mean, there's a lot of ways to understand what the vulnerabilities are within applications, network systems, and even code. But a penetration test is going to take that next step to understand from the vulnerabilities that are discovered what is actually exploitable, what can actually be penetrated, hence the name pen test, what can be penetrated by a malicious actor to cause ill effects, downtime, data loss. That's the quickest and most efficient way that I describe penetration testing.
And so, Joe, you said something very important here, in that we're looking at vulnerabilities and trying to discover ways that we can actually exercise an exploit of that vulnerability, which makes me want to ask the question for those listening. So if they currently have existing internal and external vulnerability assessment scanning going on, so they've got a solid process there, is that distinctly different than what you're describing with penetration testing?
No, it's pretty much the same. I would say it's a subset of the process. If you're talking about vulnerability scanning, we're purely understanding through a database of signatures and other means what vulnerabilities exist. At that point, we understand that there's vulnerabilities, but we don't know if they can actually be exploited by a threat actor. So you can think of it again. I can spin this in another perspective. A vulnerability is a security flaw. It is some sort of security issue, but it does not actually become a real risk until you understand what the level of exploitation could be and what the effect of exploitation could be. If that makes sense.
That does make sense. So as I think about this, and the reason I ask is I've seen a number of automated pen testing platforms or programs on the market that really just appear to be vulnerability scanners. And I just, for my own self, want to be sure that I bucket these things in the right way. So again, penetration testing goes above and beyond that initial layer of information we can discern from what's returned through a traditional vulnerability scan. Is that fair?
That's 100% fair. In fact, I'll even add some context to that. So in vulnerability scanning, we perform a level of vulnerability scanning in our pen testing. So we will use multiple tools. There's some tools that are good for web apps. There's some tools that are good for certain aspects and frameworks of a web app. There's certain vulnerability scanners that are good for network. So we're going to use multiple tools to accomplish this task, to understand what the actual vulnerabilities are. And from that is actually when we take the next step. So vulnerability scanning in itself is actually a good thing, because it's going to show you the small misconfigurations that actually may or may not be exploitable. So there's different shades here. There's different shades of gray here.
Interesting. And so, Joe, you talk about vulnerabilities, you talk about threats. In my mind, kind of pulls out to that old definition. I think we've all seen at one time or another of risk, and that's risk as a product of your asset value, your vulnerabilities and threats. And for the business leaders listening, one of the things that we continue to talk about is value creation. You want compliance to be a value creation mechanism. You want pen testing to be a value creation mechanism. And I think as part of that, ISACA defines value creation as recognizing desired outcomes at an optimized risk and cost. And so this concept of risk makes me think and makes me really want to ask, Joe, do you see penetration testing as a mechanism that leaders can use to create value for their organization? And if so, what does that even look like?
It's exponential. So with the value of pen testing, I think I've actually spoke to this multiple times. What's dangerous for your organization is if you're not doing it. And I know that we may touch on that a little bit later on. And it's
we will.
But the value of pen testing really breaks down to what you're doing with it. So there's a lot of flavors of what we could be doing with penetration testing. We can be using it for compliance obligations, which is very, very broad, right? That's broad and wide. So a lot of our clients are using this for compliance obligations, right? You have a SOC, you have an ISO, PCI, you are obligated to get your penetration testing done with audits and that match that scope. But the real value is understanding what your true threat surface is and understanding how we are fixing over time the evolving threats with our information security. So we like to break a balance between compliance and information security and provide a pen test that actually works for both. Because the reason we're doing this, yes, we have to meet compliance obligations, but we also want this to be valuable. We want it to add value to the organization, that you are understanding what the flaws are over time, what frameworks are going out of date, and possibly what vulnerabilities a attacker could leverage to actually break into your organization and damage your reputation. So the real value is, and I'm going to say it, do more than one pen test a year. And I know that that may not be possible across the board for all organizations, but I do, and I always have recommended a level of vulnerability scanning, which is almost in itself as continuous monitoring, let's just say. I can even touch on that later if you're curious. But a level of vulnerability scanning, a level of pen testing to meet your compliance objectives, and even additional to understand other environments that may not be in scope for your audits, that could be a massive hidden risk for your organization. So that's definitely a great value that you should be thinking about with pen testing and what it can offer.
And Joe, you hit on something I think that's really, really important for a lot of our listeners, and that's this idea that pen tests are an annual event, a transaction, if you will. I think you'll see written in the PCI DSS, for those of you that do have a PCI obligation, that of course you need to have your annual pen, but then also as part of your risk management program, you want to have a pen test upon significant change to your environment. And Joe, I think amongst other points of pushback you get, are there common misconceptions, if you will, or common rebuttals people give you when you recommend that they do add additional penetration testing throughout the year?
Tons. But then I hate to see if something happens, right? That was always my quote. It's not if, it's when. And as you can see, if you open any sort of technical news in the industry, you'll see another breach, you'll see another hack. And a lot of these companies are mature organizations with massive security budgets. So they have the money to do pen testing every year. A lot of it is third-party risk. I mean, we could go on and start saying every reason about why organizations get hacked. No, we're not going to go down that road. We're going to talk about definitely the objections that I hear to it and what we should be doing. So multiple pen tests a year is great. It's a great thing. Again, like you said, it's not hard, or it's not easy for organizations to also do additional pen testing aside their compliance obligations. But that was my previous comment to, I want to make a pen test work, not only for your compliance objectives, but for your organization. So I want you to improve your information security, but I also want to meet compliance obligations. And that sometimes allows a combination approach where maybe you can't afford multiple pen tests, but I can offer you something that's going to meet those obligations and it's going to be good for the organization. But it is not a replacement for the continuous approach that I previously mentioned. I definitely think that organizations should start to think about a second pen test, maybe split it up, space it out. And yes, after significant changes is always a good thing. After lift and shift from on-prem to cloud, after implementing new frameworks, after any sort of updates. I mean, these are the things that should trigger a new pen test, which leads me to this, continuous monitoring, right? All of the new frameworks nowadays are starting to point to continuous monitoring, continuous approach, real-time approach. And it really underscores that the point-in-time approach is great, but it has not been overly successful. So having that continuous approach or even a recurring approach to understanding vulnerabilities is really what you want to, that's where you want to be. You want to be in a mode where you are continuously looking at your environment as the environment evolves, as components and frameworks evolve, and you're understanding what the vulnerabilities are. You can accomplish that through automated scanning.
Okay.
In years past, we've always said, well, it's better to stray away from the automated platforms and go to something manual, not only because it's required, but it's deeper. I actually say that, again, it's different shades of gray. You should be doing your annual and manual pen testing either once or twice a year, and you should also be doing some form of automated scanning. That's going to allow you to stay ahead of threats before they turn into big problems.
Interesting. And Joe, I do think more about the pushback. First of all, I love this plan, and I do want to continue to unpack it. But more about the pushback. So, and I hate to ask you to speculate, but I'm going to. I think with me, so I've got a cold. I'm the type of person that will simply choose to ignore the cold and not go to the doctor in hopes that the cold will go away. So, for whatever reason, I choose ignorance over professional feedback. Do you think in our field that there are organizations whose leaders prefer to choose ignorance about the risks as opposed to getting feedback? Or do you think there's something more going on with the hesitation and resistance to adding additional penetration testing?
I hate to say it, I think a lot of it's budget. And why am I saying that? Why am
That's
I saying
good.
that? Everybody has to run within a tight budget, right? The costs are a big factor. And a lot of organizations are budgeting security exercises and endpoint security and everything, and it's within a budget. And just turning around and looking to do a second pen test, which could be a duplicate or larger of their first, sometimes is out of the realm of affordability, right? I'm not saying everybody's issue is affordability and budget, but I am saying that's one that I know I've spoke about to some clients. Some of it may be ignorance, Patrick. Some of it may be.
No judgment.
Some of it is also education. A lot of organizations feel like they are getting what they need out of one. And me personally, as someone that used to write exploits, I know that is not, it's just not a possibility. Having the ability for one pen test to cover over time, it's not going to scale. And that is the reason why we recommend continuous monitoring, that continuous approach that actually allows you to understand your threat surface over the other 11 months. So you get your pen test 1 month. What are you doing for those other months? And again, the reason I'm going down this road is about education. It's about what are the major blockers of wanting to do a second pen test. Sometimes it's budget, sometimes it's ignorance, and sometimes it's just education. It's reaching out and educating on what we know can lessen the threat surface. And it's a combination of tools. It's like an onion. So there's multiple layers here. You use your pen testing for a purpose, you use vulnerability scanning for a purpose, you use code scanning for a purpose, and you use that automated overtime approach for a certain purpose.
Joe, and what I love about this idea of education or edification for our listeners is to bring this back kind of where we started with value creation. And it's a process of recognizing desired outcomes at optimized risk and cost. It seems that the penetration testing and the continuous monitoring can allow for real identification of risk associated with an environment. Where costs become part of the concern and creating the outcomes they want, though, it seems that there needs to be some flexibility to ensure things can stay within budget, not just from a testing, but also from a remediation perspective for our leaders. And so, just to help the listeners connect dots, you've really hit on this idea of continuous monitoring multiple times. Maybe for the listeners, if you could describe the process of a traditional pen test and then describe the process of continuous monitoring, just so they can connect the dots in their own minds to how this really can be a mechanism for value creation.
Exactly. And I will. Yes. I mean, everything you said was actually spot on. So I'm going to agree with it, and then I'm going to explain. So,
Yes.
so the way it works is pen testing, it's a point in time exercise. So we're going to test the scope that you provide us for that scope for a predetermined amount of time that it's going to take to do that scope. And we do our testing. We write a report. You actually get the report deliverable of the testing that we did during that window, the testing window, and you did your pen test. So you were able to bundle that in with your compliance report as proof that you did your pen testing, your annual pen testing, and we have a good day. However, there's now the rest of the time till our next audit, which is way too long to leave our undiscovered threats. So the way to do that, and we're not alone in this approach, we have a tool, we have an automated offering that will actually scan the scope or even an extra part of your scope, just to understand what the threat surface looks like. So we already know what our vulnerabilities were, our exploitable vulnerabilities were through the pen test. And now through our automated platform, you can log in and scan that exact same scope to now determine whether or not anything else has fallen out of date, anything else has become vulnerable. So that continuous approach is now understanding as the frameworks evolve, as components go out of date. If you've written any of your code in Java, if you've written any of your code in Go for any mobile apps, you're understanding now as those components age and go through their iterations through development, because all web apps, all sites, they're made with certain frameworks and components. And those frameworks and components eventually get vulnerabilities and go out of date themselves, which makes your environment vulnerable. So having said that, the automated solutions are great at understanding on an interval, on a recurring schedule, if anything has popped up that's new. So we actually have this automated scanning tool, and we recommend it as the continuous approach, as I call it. It is the not the or, it's the and. So we like to add it as your pen test and automated scanning platform, your pen test and your continuous monitoring. It's not the or. We don't recommend automated solutions as the or. However, it's not a one size fits all. We look to have a conversation to really understand what your scope is, understand what your compliance objectives are, and understand what your information security objectives are. And from that, we derive a plan.
Outstanding, Joe. Outstanding. And to that end, maybe for the participants that haven't necessarily worked with us in the past and don't necessarily know what partnership looks like through the course of a penetration test, for our listeners, maybe you could tell them a little bit about what to expect during a traditional penetration test, and where possible, a little bit about what to expect during the continuous monitoring, during that and phase.
You sure you want to hear about this? Because it might scare some people. No, I'm kidding. So we have our process down to a science. We have embedded project management that's exclusive to our group to really streamline the way we do our operations. But when you're getting a pen test with us, there's different stages. We have our kickoff stage. We have planning stages, in which in that process, after signature of an SOW, it basically kicks off the process where the client and the stakeholders on the client side will meet with the technical side from our pen test team. So a manager will be assigned for all continuing communication, and a number of testers may be assigned to that project. So in that time, we exchange information. We exchange contact information, just in case something pops up. There's an escalation path to immediately have support. And I think that that's important. It's important that,
Yes.
that immediate support for any issues, because anytime there's hackers, people get nervous. So that is our open door to communication there. We plan when we're going to do the test during that phase. So after we actually have a date, we will start the testing on that date. And during that time, we really don't need anything. We operate pretty independent. We shouldn't have any questions at that point, and we will complete the testing for that duration of time for that scope. Now, after that, there's a period of time in which we're going to finish the report. The report goes through stages and then gets handed off to the client. So that's a very quick way to describe our process for pen testing. It's very manual, right? Only at least 15 to 20% of what we do during an actual pen test is automated scanning, spidering, and enumeration. The rest of the time after that 20% is actual manual attack techniques. So we're looking to do fuzzing, we're looking to do injection, we're looking to understand the vulnerabilities that we discovered in that 20% of that beginning initial time. We're looking to understand from what we discovered there, what is actually exploitable in the later part of our testing window, to really show you what the risk is. We want to show you what the risk is. We're not doing a glorified vulnerability scan and saying, hey, we found all these flaws. No, we are looking to actually tell you a threat actor can break in to your environment by exploiting these two vulnerabilities. And here's the real risk of exploitation. With an automated solution, it's a little bit more streamlined. So 100% of that goes towards scanning. 100% of that goes to continuously scanning the environment. So for that, you would sign into the automated platform that we have. You'd have your dashboard, and you'd be able to understand what was discovered and what the vulnerabilities are. But it will not go through that level of manual exploitation like a pen test will. It will not.
And then, Joe, is your expectation that the testing is destructive in any way, shape, or form? Would users expect servers to go down, systems to become unavailable? In effect, is a pen test intended to wreak havoc across an organization, or are they meant to be as graceful and gracious as possible?
Everybody that's hearing that question right now probably has a horror story, right? Everybody, but they've heard of the stories, did not experience them. Maybe there's a small percentage of clients that have experienced some sort of ill effect, but I can tell you, with this pen test team that we've developed over time, over the years, we have testing etiquette where we're not going to perform denial of service attacks unless you explicitly want us to do that. We're not going to perform any sort of database queries that would result in data loss or destruction or downtime. So we do follow rules of engagement. We are open to additional constraints that you will not have any downtime or ill effects. And just to put the icing on the cake, we haven't had ill effects or downtime in years. Our testers are they're trained to understand you have to throttle your scanning, you have to throttle your testing, because if you do something in a production environment, which over 90% of the testing we do is in production. That's another question. 90% is in production. And we don't experience ill effects or downtime.
Interesting. And Joe, you just made me think of another question that I think some of our listeners might have, and that's this idea of teams or teaming. You've talked about testers, you've talked about the plan they execute. I also hear kicked around these terms: blue team, red team, purple team. Maybe for our listeners, you could talk a little bit about what that means. And then a question for you: do we as A-LIGN offer services that might help our listeners deliver on the value that those separate components create?
Yeah. So I know me and you have had a lot of these conversations offline. I can tell you that. As far as red team, blue team, and purple teaming, this was originally reserved for very mature organizations. So organizations that already were doing their pen testing, even some of them doing multiple pen tests a year, even some of them having internal teams. So traditionally out of the realm of affordability, right?
Yes.
However, over the recent years, we've seen, and this is not a discussion of federal, this is not a discussion of any of that, but I'm rolling it in. Over the years, you've seen different exercises requiring or suggesting red teaming. So, for example, the switch from NIST Rev 4 to Rev 5 suggests red teaming and pen testing. So, if you are in a federal environment and you're looking for your FedRAMP annual or initial, you are now required to do a red team exercise in addition to your pen testing. How did we get here? Well, I'll tell you how we got here. So the continuous approach, I keep saying it, the continuous approach, and yes, red teaming is a point in time, but it's a different tactic on how we're recognizing flaws. A red team is less focused on vulnerability A, vulnerability C, vulnerability D, and it's more focused on let's see how an attacker can get in, stay in, and act. That's almost the three pillars of red teaming: get in, stay in, and act. That's what red teamers are looking to do. So
the time domain necessarily expands, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Joe, but it doesn't feel like this. Can I exploit this vulnerability? It's can I exploit this vulnerability and stay around for a little bit? Maybe we set up camp here and see what else we can see.
Patrick, that's exactly what it's about. So in a red team, the skills to do it are completely different than pen testing. So regular pen testers, it's a different mindset. And as I mentioned before, I started to go down the path of continuous approach. Red teaming continue like traditionally was 6 months to even more, like massively long exercises over time to understand how do we exercise people, process, and technology. That was the real vision of doing a red team, understanding deficiencies that we could uncover to strengthen our security posture. So in a red teaming, back to what I was saying, it's less about discovering vulnerabilities in a defined scope and more about discovering, well, let's test the human element because we know the human element is the most trickable. We know that that's the most vulnerable. So
Yes.
let's see if we could fish a user, get in, and then see if we're detected. Cue the blue team. So a blue team's job is understanding what can actually be detected. A purple team is the combination of both working together. A purple team exercise is the red team and the blue team working together. It's a coordinated effort, bouncing back and forth. Hey, this is what I'm going to do. Blue team, yes, I detected XYZ. So that's what a purple team exercise is. It's the combination of red and blue that makes purple. That's the methodology behind it. But yeah, but these exercises, once reserved for mature organizations, are now being brought down to the realm of affordability. So we developed a streamlined red team approach that is very cost effective, very compared to the deep six figures that larger organizations were charging for these exercises, which they still are. The scopes could be larger, so it's not unheard of that organizations can be deep in that direction. But we have brought down the floor for these organizations with preserving the exact same methodology and the exact same process using the exact same tactics and tools. So red teaming is great. It is a great way to understand a different perspective on your information security.
And Joe, as you're saying this, we actually in the chat from Daniel had a question. Does our organization pen test simulate ransomware attacks? Is that something that's part of any of the testing that we currently do?
We actually have a ransomware assessment. So I love it. I think that there's not enough light that's being broadcast on the ransomware exercises that organizations can be doing, but we have one. We developed it years back, and it is a multi-part audit assessment that provides risk assessment approach. It provides a disaster recovery and business continuity approach, and it provides a specialty crafted pen test to understand what the internal threat surface is and if anything could be exploitable from the inside out, simulating what ransomware would do. Yeah, part phishing exercise because we understand the human element's always the weakest, but the pen test is a specialty type that understands what we can do internally on that threat surface that ransomware takes advantage of. And then could data leave? We're not going to siphon your data, I promise you. We're not going to get any confidential data out. These are exercises that do proof of concept to prove that it's possible. So yes, we absolutely have. And I would love to talk about it more in depth.
Yeah. So Daniel, after the webinar, feel free to reach out. We'd love to continue the conversation with you. And Joe, continuing the conversation, you're talking about ransomware, and I worked in the MSP space for a lot of years before I moved over to cybersecurity and compliance. I was there around the time that CryptoLocker and the real early stage ransomware started to hit. And it's amazing to see the evolution over time. But it's not just ransomware that's evolved over time. Other technologies have as well. Bring in over the past couple of years what we see now with AI. And many of our existing customers, perhaps many of our listeners, are using AI in some meaningful way to generate value for your organizations. So, Joe, I don't know if you have an opinion about penetration testing, perhaps red teaming around AI, but I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to hear your take on this.
So, Patrick, are we generating value? Or are we generating vulnerabilities? I think we're doing both.
I think we're doing both.
Notice what I said, though. Generating vulnerabilities. With value comes logic. With logic and complexity comes vulnerability. So I think that adopting AI I can't speak how great it is. It makes things more efficient. It can do things better for us, repetitive things that we can't do. It opens the door to different things. It's great. I think adoption of AI is important. However, the education element around the threat surface is critical. So depending on the technology you're using, whatever language model you're using, whatever model you're using, you're going to inherit flaws of those models. So that's one thing that needs to be on the radar. Whatever model you're using, combination of models, whatever that setup is, you have to understand that you are inheriting certain vulnerabilities with using those models. Now, you're also introducing new ones with your custom development or custom implementation of what you have that has it integrated. I think that one of the massive risks now is data inside that model. So possibly divulging data to a model that it can be extracted somehow, or it can get in the wrong hands. Because remember, what we're putting in these things, it lives inside them. Right? So prompt injection, other ways of trying to get things out of these models is going to become a top threat. Understanding what can be siphoned out of these. Remember, we always talk about the human element being the weakest link. Well, if there's something simulating a human element and it's ready to divulge that information just from asking, I think we should be scared. But I think we really need to understand sooner than later ways that we can test these models. And you're right, red teaming has now become a top focus point, a top conversation starter about, hey, how do we test these models? Well, OWASP released guidance. And for those that know or don't know, OWASP is what we use for our web applications for doing the top 10. They publish the top 10 risks for web applications. They also do the top 10 risks for APIs. They also do the top 10 risks for mobile. So we use that as our frameworks for our testing. We follow the OWASP methodologies and frameworks. And with that said, OWASP released large language model guidance. So we're going to be adopting that in the testing that we do. And with that, you're right. You mentioned the other, some of the other frameworks. I think Microsoft has a very good paper about their red teaming. We're seeing these AI red teams pop up left and right. I think it's something that everybody should be actively looking at, because this is a place that's evolving very rapidly. But no matter how you're looking at this, no matter what you're following, just know that if you introduce AI into your organization, you should be doing a level of testing to understand what the threats around that system are.
And Joe, just to help bring an element of importance to this, not alarm, but importance. But to your point, technologies internally are continuing to evolve. These are the very same technologies that bad actors are using to gain access to the vulnerabilities of those systems. And so you the other day were explaining to me how there's this proliferation of AI enabled hacking tools on the market today.
Yeah,
So I don't know if you care to hear a little bit about that. And in my mind, these tools are the very reason that being proactive and actually doing red teaming, actually penetration testing of your own volition becomes so important. Because if you don't find your vulnerabilities, it's almost guaranteed that someone else will.
yeah, that's a good way to say it. Yeah, we actually spoke two different things that actually scare me. Um, there was the pen test GPT that actually is aiding pen testers to do pen testing. So somebody that traditionally wouldn't be that great at doing penetration testing can now be led by this large language model. So it's greatly accelerating some people that may have ill intent to do not so good things. So in a way, AI can help us, but it can also help the wrong people as well. Another way it can help the wrong people is the AI assisted malware. Different ways that large language models can shift malware to be less detectable, can morph malware over time. I know that there's a lot of research, there's a lot of articles about how AI can morph and change malware, and yeah, it's scary. These are just one of the many reasons about why we should understand what the threat surface and what the vulnerabilities are with the forms of AI that we've integrated into our businesses. We really should understand for those models what are the vulnerabilities and flaws, and we should be doing that AI red teaming to understand really broad approach. What can security specialists find with these technologies? What are these technologies doing that we might not know they're doing? So things of that nature. And even building on that, I keep hearing rumblings about monitoring for AI. So understanding how to monitor the models over time. And there's even products that have been created to do that.
There are.
To create the models, to understand over time, what are these models doing? How are they doing it? Is there anything concerning that we should know that's happening with the models? It's visibility. It really is visibility. It boils down to visibility.
Interesting. And what I love about this is it's visibility that leaders have to make good business decisions. Without that visibility, you really are just taking a guess. Again, with me in this cold, what medicine should I be taking? I won't actually know unless I speak with an expert to find out what's really going on. So many businesses are walking around with a cold today, with major blind spots, if you will, in their security posture, and just don't have any idea. So Joe, to maybe bring this back to kind of where we started and ask some very direct questions, for those listeners that are only performing penetration testing associated with particular compliance framework, FedRAMP, PCI, maybe they're doing it to support their SOC 2 examination. Maybe they're doing it to support their security posture for ISO 27001. For those listeners, would you say that's enough? Or do they need to take a more holistic view about how they think about really examining the perimeter of their environments and what their vulnerabilities really are?
See, again, that this response is, it's many shades of gray, but to answer your question, I do recommend that you take a proactive approach to do more than just your annual, a proactive approach to do more than just the scope of the audit. It's just understanding what your true threat surface is goes far beyond the compliance. It goes far beyond the scope of what we're doing our audit for. And I think organizations know that, but the holistic approach always works best. Understanding your people, your process, and your technology is critical to your true threat surface, because it could be that one flaw, that one area of scope that resulted in a breach or downtime and business reputational damage is the top threat I see. You don't forget about the hacks. Everybody right now that's listening to this probably has heard of some large organization getting hacked, and you remember that. It sticks with you. Reputational damage is one of the top threats, and that's one of the top things that I try to push away objections on about why do I even need to do a pen test? Sometimes it's not why do I need to do more than one, it's why do I need to do one, period. And that's one of the main things I say is the biggest risks. You spent time and money on building a reputation. Don't let one hack ruin it.
Well, and Joe, and I think, on that spectrum, you talk a lot about the end where people are not doing enough. I also know that you work with organizations that are doing some really incredible things, really proactive things. And I know you can't name names, but can you maybe give our listeners examples of what some companies are doing that are doing it right, in your opinion?
Absolutely. And you know what? It scales. It scales from even an enterprise organization to a small business. And you're probably wondering what scales?
What scales?
The approach. Do your annual pen test to meet your compliance objectives and add that continuous approach to understand over time if any new vulnerabilities popped up. It can be as simple as that, but that is the holistic approach. It's more than just the annual pen test. It's more than just that one single point in time annually. We're looking at moving towards something for having visibility, right? Everything is now coming to an end. So everything we've spoke about on this call is now coming in one response. That continuous approach that we've said, it needs to be a holistic plan. It needs to be, let's satisfy our audit obligations. Let's have something for the other 11 months. The automated scanning, although not perfect, it allows you that visibility to understand what new vulnerabilities pop up. And you can now put attention to those. You can now look at those and focus in and say, well, yeah, we upgraded a lot of our applications. Or yeah, well, we just migrated a lot of our old on-prem infrastructure to cloud. So now we've introduced new vulnerabilities. So sometimes you're saved by the automated scanning that detects vulnerabilities. It detects them, even though you have all these different initiatives going on at the same time. You have different groups, IT security, developers, DevOps, all these different groups all come together when those vulnerabilities come out. So in a way, that continuous approach is what you need to understand what your threat surface is as you evolve, as your business goes on. So that's what I would say scales, whether you're a enterprise or you're a small business. That one approach, the one manual pen test plus your automated scanning throughout the year will really help your organization stay ahead of these threats.
And that's what our leaders need to know, Joe. Hey, we've got one question, and then we're running out of time. I can't believe this. But one more question from Daniel, as it relates to the ransomware attacks. Would we be looking internally and externally at those attacks? And then a more open-ended question, and that is, what kind of phishing testing do we do as part of our penetration testing?
I actually like both of those questions. And I will hit first on the phishing part because it plays into the second question. So our phishing exercises are a lot different than some of the, I don't want to say fast food approach, but I want to say the bulk phishing platforms are you clicked it, I gotcha. It's great. It's great to know that some employees need that extra training because you're identifying the weak links before the attackers can prey on them. So the phishing training is doing what it's intended to do, understand who the weak links in the process may be. But But what it's failing to do is understanding the real risk that a ransomware attacker would employ. A ransomware attacker is going to do due diligence to understand where the weak links are and who they may be and what access they may have. So phishing somebody with no access maybe can get you in to execute some sort of payload, ransomware payload, or phishing somebody that has elevated access or is an easier target or has access to critical systems. That's probably going to be a better win. So we, in our phishing exercises, we perform a level of open source intelligence. We scrape social media profiles, dark web, the internet. We understand who the users that are vulnerable may be. And then we craft a specialty scenario targeting those users. So it may be different that we target person A and person B, a completely different narrative. We don't want to make it look obvious. We don't want to send bulk messages out to a ton of people. It's the same message that the Amazon gift card. Here's a gift card for you. Oh, it's the busy CEO on the way to the airport. So we try not to use
It's
those.
with a zero instead of an O. Yeah, yeah.
I'm not saying that all the phishing providers are using those very obvious narratives, but I'm saying we put a lot of planning into our social engineering exercises. We put targeting and planning into them, and we look to target the users that we know would be likely of compromise. So with that said, we use that same approach in a ransomware assessment. So we look to understand who we'd be able to phish, and we can either understand that through our own means or through information you provide. So if you provide us and said, hey, we want these users to be included in this engagement because they have high access, that's great. All that's going to do is accelerate this exercise and allow a higher chance of success. So we welcome the information that you give us, but we're always going to go in blind to discover what we can in addition to what you give us. So that said, the ransomware assessment is going to understand externally if somebody can get in. So we're going to look at your firewalls. We're going to look at any different cloud WAFs, to understand if there's any way an attacker could get in externally. A lot of times, the external threat surface is well hardened, so we're not able to actually get in. But there is an extremely small percentage of misconfigurations that could actually allow somebody to get in. So yes, we are absolutely looking at the external threat surface. We're looking at what can happen from the inside out. And there's the other risk assessment approaches as well as the pen test exercise.
Joe, thank you so much. Thank you for the dialogue today. Thank you for sharing your expertise. Daniel, thank you for interacting, asking questions. Hopefully we answered them. Again, please feel free to follow up after the fact if you'd like to discuss more. To the remainder of our viewers, thank you for investing your time in us today. We hope you'll join us again. Until then, have a wonderful day, incredible afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.